Hello and welcome to my first Mormon-themed screencast entitled Why People Leave the LDS Church and What Family, Friends, and Community Can Do About It. My name is John DeLynn. Just to tell you a little bit about me, I'm a 5th or 6th generation Mormon. I'm a descendant or relative of Ezra T. Benson, which also means I'm a distant cousin of Ezra Taft Benson. Also Samuel Rose Parkinson, the P in my middle initial stands for Parkinson. I'm a lifelong member of the church. I'm 36 years old. I'm still quite active in the church. I served a mission in Guatemala and also 4 months in Arizona, full mission. Was a zone leader there in both missions. I was married in the Washington, D.C. temple. I'm married with 4 children. I'm currently serving as Elders Quorum instructor in my ward here in North Logan in Utah. And I'm also a former early morning seminary instructor. So I just felt like it was important to begin this presentation by letting you know that this presentation doesn't come from an anti-Mormon, an ex-Mormon, someone who's got it out against the church. Some of you might even accuse me of being a wolf in sheep's clothing. But I just want to state on the record that I'm a devoted, active member of the church. I'm committed to making the church a better place and to doing my part within it. And I wanted to sort of get that out in front. Now, every year, thousands of devout members of the LDS Church leave it or go inactive. And you might want to think that these are just, maybe converts that quickly fall inactive. But the truth is, many of the people I know are like me, 5th or 6th generation Mormons. They descend from prominent church leaders, including Brigham Young and Joseph Smith. Many of them are returned missionaries who have been married in the temple, who have large families. That's sort of the profile of many of the people that are leaving the church each year, especially when they leave due to historical or doctrinal issues. A recent Salt Lake Tribune article highlighted very publicly what's been known in sort of the circles I've been running in for quite some time, which is that, basically 2/3 of the church is inactive. So, there are 4 to 5 million active members of the church, but there's 7 to 8 million inactive. In fact, they say that 1/3 of the church, they don't even know, where the people are. These people don't call themselves Mormons. They were baptized and immediately fell away. And so we're looking at only sort of 1/3 to maybe, 2/5 of the church membership actually being active in the church. So, this is something very important to keep in mind. Inactivity, there are more inactive Mormons than active Mormons, both in and outside of Utah. It's very easy to throw labels on these people who have fallen away, to say that they're sinners, that they must have some sin. They want to, they just want to drink alcohol or have illicit sex or take drugs or whatever. It's very easy to say that these people are just weak, maybe they weren't as valiant in pre-existence. It's easy to say that they stopped going to the temple or they stopped reading the scriptures and that's why they fell away. Or you can just blame it on the internet and say, oh, that dang internet, or anti-Mormon literature, they stumbled upon that and now they've left. But the truth is, those are cop-outs in many instances. Sometimes they may be true, but in many, many instances that I've come across, these are not what's at the core of why many people are leaving the church. And in fact, to those who have serious issues with the church, these assumptions are highly, highly insulting. Yet they're the ones that often seem to be offered, most often, as reasons or justifications or attempts to explain why people leave. So now I'd like to sort of take a moment to answer the question, why would anyone leave the LDS Church? If you really want to help them or love them or be their friend or treat them in a Christ-like way, you must know what they're thinking and feeling. You certainly cannot befriend them or reach them or help them if they need help if you don't understand where they're coming from. So part of the purpose of this presentation is to give you a sense for their mindset and why people leave. So I'm going to give you sort of a brief synopsis of how it happens in my experience. I will be listing some controversial or unpleasant aspects of Mormonism, and I just want to tell you up front that the only reason I'm doing it is not to just expose you to dangerous things. But if you want to help these people, you have to know where they're at, what got them to the place they're at, so that you can then work with them or talk to them or love them and just understand where they're coming from. In my experience, it usually happens in this way. There's some seminal event in their lives that raises an important question about Mormonism. Let's say they're called as a seminary or a gospel doctrine teacher, which was true in my case. All of a sudden they want to learn more about the church and they want to be a better teacher, so they start digging into church history. Or maybe they're watching some random TV show and all of a sudden it mentions Mormons in a way that they're unfamiliar. Or maybe there's some big news event that has to do with Mormonism that's pretty controversial that makes them start asking or thinking about some questions. Or maybe they stumble across some book or magazine article that talks about Mormonism in a way they're not familiar. And of course there's always the option of some close family or friend announcing that they're leaving the church. That can be very jolting to some, and of course stumbling upon anti-Mormon literature. But there's always some sort of event that kicks off a quest for further knowledge and understanding. It's usually not done with the intent to leave, but instead to be a better member, to follow the admonition, to study things out in our mind, to seek truth, to be lovers of truth and of wisdom. And that's, in my experience, how it often starts. But from there, it becomes difficult. Some examples include a recent Southpark episode where it talks about the life of Joseph Smith. And while it's talking about it, it shows Joseph Smith sticking his head in a hat, reading from a peepstone. And then it shows Oliver Cowdery translating. And people would ask, what is that? Why is Joseph sticking his head in a hat? That's something I've never heard of. We'll talk about that more soon. Or maybe it's the Larry King interview where Gordon B. Hinckley comes on and Larry King asks him what the church's view is on polygamy, and Gordon B. Hinckley answers, it's not doctrinal. For many within the church who heard that statement, it was a shock. Or when Larry King asked President Hinckley, what's your thoughts on God once being a man? And President Hinckley's response was something to the effect of, oh, well, I don't know much about that. I don't know that we teach it. I don't know that we emphasize it. For the average Mormon who's grown up in the church, statements like that can be very shocking and confusing. Or the recent Newsweek article that says things like mentioning the printing press that was destroyed. Most people probably don't know about the Nauvoo Expositor and the printing press that was destroyed as a precursor to Joseph's incarceration in Carthage and his martyrdom. Or maybe, many people, including me, don't know that Joseph Smith had 30 wives. I didn't learn this until I was 30 years old after a lifetime in the church. And that he had massive debts and hundreds of enemies. We don't learn about Joseph's weaknesses in church. And so when we read about it in a magazine, all of a sudden it can become troublesome. And then, another quote was from this article was that decades of serious and honest scholarship have failed to uncover credible evidence that these Book of Mormon civilizations ever existed, which is a quote from Simon Southerton. But the point isn't that these are, smoking guns that say the church isn't true. But what they are things that Mormons, often don't hear in church, hear throughout their lives, and when they hear it for the first time in mainstream media or outside the church, it becomes shocking and sends them on a quest to learn more. News events, one example is the Mark Hoffman affair, where, an ingenious young man who was also quite diabolical is able to fool Boyd K. Packer and Spencer W. Kimball and Gordon B. Hinckley and forge documents, convince the brethren who we would all expect to have extra special powers of premonition and of being good judges of character and having the spirit of discernment, which is an unfair expectation probably, but we do expect it, and we ask why they weren't more in tune with the Holy Ghost to know that Mark Hoffman was a fraud and to keep the two murders that happened from happening. So those are, that's another type of event that would set someone off with questions. And of course Elder Oaks himself has acknowledged that the brethren were fooled. And, one very classic way that people start on this quest is by just reading church history. The Journal of Discourses is full of quotes that I think the church is frankly embarrassed about now. Whether it's Brigham Young's racist quotes or his teachings of Adam God theory or blood atonement. These are teachings that we've distanced ourselves from officially as a church, and we de-emphasize and even try and say that we don't believe these things anymore. And of course, a book like Fawn Brody's No Man Knows My History, written by David Owen McKay's niece, viewed by many as one of the most important biographies on Joseph Smith, can just do sincere damage to your view of Joseph Smith relative to how you sort of viewed him when you were growing up. So once these seminal events occur in a Mormon's life, one of the first things they do now on the internet is go to Google and they type in some questions. And of course, as soon as they do, there are several websites that are there ready to talk about these issues. Unfortunately, none of them are the church websites, because the church doesn't really like to deal with these issues in any depth. So there are no, official church responses on these issues that are in any way substantive. There are some apologetic sites, and sometimes those are helpful, but for many people, apologetic techniques just don't work. They turn people off and even make them feel the church is less credible. So where they often turn are ex-Mormon or anti-Mormon sites where people have a lot of anger, sometimes justifiably so, a lot of frustration, and that's sort of what leads them to quickly want to leave the church and ask to have their records removed from the church. If I had to sort of explain or summarize, what happens in this quest, we Mormons oftentimes are taught growing up throughout our entire lives that the world is black and white, that there's bad in the world and good, and anything you come across in the world can be put in one of those two categories. The world is either black or it's white. It's a very simple point of view, and that's how we see it. Prophets, good. Scriptures, perfect. The church, good, perfect. Everything's under control. General authorities, inspired. And everything is either good or bad. In other churches, bad. Other scriptures that aren't ours, bad. And that's sort of how we see the world. Non-Mormons, not as good as Mormons. Our church, true. All other churches, false. And once a Mormon starts digging into this history and the culture, we realize that there is such a thing as a prophet who's made major mistakes. There is such a thing as a church that's made major mistakes. There is such a thing as scriptures that have flaws, even LDS scriptures that have flaws. And all of a sudden they start seeing the world for the first time in shades and degrees and color. And it's quite a complex new worldview. And what you see between these two images is a huge gap. And that gap is dramatic and it's shocking. And this is sort of what someone who's left the church experiences. Their whole world crumbles and they see the world in a different light for the very first time. It doesn't have to be a bad thing, but if there aren't the right supports and role models, for example, to be there when they go through this, it can have disastrous consequences for them, for their family, etc. So when their world falls apart, what do? Now what I'd like to do is give you an introduction to the major issues that the average person leaves the church over. And I want to make 3 disclaimers about it. Everything I show you here can be easily substantiated through church publications. So I'm not bringing up a bunch of stuff that's found just in people who hated the prophet, and so they wrote bad things about him that are lies. I did my best to create this presentation only from stuff that can be substantiated through church publications, through the Ensign, through Times and Seasons, through Millennial Star, through the Journal Discourses, through official church publications. So most of the stuff the apostles and prophets themselves have acknowledged and found some way to try and defend. So know that at the outset. Also know that this is not an exercise in me blaming the brethren, saying that they're bad, saying that I'm better than them or no more than the brethren. Most of these issues I don't lay at the feet of the brethren, but instead with the general membership, or frankly with just humanity and the flaws of people. But I just wanted to sort of get that out in the open. And then finally, nothing in this entire presentation do I believe is a smoking gun that proves that the church is, quote, not true, unquote, or not inspired by God. Not one thing here. So know that even though I'm about to show you some really hard things, to me, none of this stuff should be viewed as, like I said, a smoking gun. So, what I learned growing up in the church about Joseph Smith, he was a pure and innocent boy, so strong and noble that when he was having major surgery on his leg, he turned down alcohol. He saw God in Jesus in the sacred grove. He translated the Book of Mormon using the Urim and Thummim. He had one wife, Emma. I had never heard of any other wife that Joseph had my entire young and adult life. And of course that he was falsely accused and persecuted several times, went to the jail in Carthage like a lamb to the slaughter, and ultimately, no other man has done more for the salvation of others than Joseph Smith saved Jesus Christ. Once you start studying church history and church documents, you find out that the history and the facts tell us additional things. So aside from all the good stuff that we know about Joseph, we also learn some things that are quite shocking. For example, that in his youth, he used a magical peepstone to help people try and find buried treasure. There are many sources for this. He admitted it himself. This is not speculation. This is fact. And any reputable historian or credible church authority will acknowledge that this is true. And, I know that when you were growing up, you likely heard that there were court cases that Joseph was involved in. Oftentimes, at least a few of these court cases were because, people were prosecuting Joseph for activities that were viewed as illegal, like treasure seeking or mysticism or black magic or whatever it was called in the day. I'm not an expert here. But this is something that, people aren't taught growing up, and so it's often hard for them to learn for the first time. The first vision itself has several different versions. So the first time Joseph told or wrote down the first vision story, he only mentioned that he saw Christ, and he didn't mention God the Father in two personages, and he didn't mention that he was told to start a new church. He just said that they had to talk about, his worthiness, etc. And as the story gets told over the 10 or 15 years after he started writing it down, you'll see that it evolves, it enhances and changes. And while there are people who have tried to make really good explanations for that, these differences are significant in my view, and are at least sort of something that would cause someone to question or wonder why he didn't get that story right the first time and keep it consistent throughout, especially when it was such an important event. You also learn, just like from that Southpark episode, that the traditional way that we've been taught that Joseph translated the Book of Mormon, which is sitting behind a veil with a Urim and Thummim on, with the plates in front of him, translating character by character, is not the way that those who were in the room with him say that he actually did it, especially during the Oliver Cowdery portions of the translation. Instead, what even Russell M. Nelson himself has acknowledged is that Joseph took that same peepstone that he used to find treasure, buried treasure, stuck it in a hat, stuck his face in the hat, and would then read off the Book of Mormon without the plates even being in the room. And this is pretty much accepted as fact now by those who understand the translation process. So, that's a shocker. Why did he have the plates if he wasn't going to use them in the translation process? Why was he sticking his head in a hat? No one's ever told me that before, yet that's the way it happened. Not that this is a smoking gun, because the word of wisdom, wasn't made really law in the church until the 20th century, but Joseph Smith drank beer and wine as an adult. He even drank wine the night before he was martyred in Carthage. He says this in his own journal. It's also shocking to find out that Joseph had 30 wives. If you go to FamilySearch.org, which is the church's genealogical website, it acknowledges that. Some of these wives were actually married to other men at the time that he was sealed to them, and these men were living. So imagine if I went to someone else's wife and said, "Will you marry me? Don't tell your husband." Imagine what that would be like, and that's sort of what the data show. These are facts. Also, several of these women were teenagers, and you kind of wonder why Joseph was marrying 14-year-old girls, for example. So, also you find out that throughout his entire time of practicing polygamy, whenever he was asked publicly if he was practicing polygamy, he denied it. I'm pretty sure Elder Oaks has acknowledged that this is a fact. It's in church publications. So in essence, Joseph Smith did not tell the truth about the fact that he was practicing polygamy. That's disturbing to many people. And of course, when a second counselor in the first presidency actually left the church and created a newspaper telling the world that Joseph was, in fact, lying and he was practicing polygamy, Joseph ordered that the printing press be destroyed, and that's what led to him being put in jail in Carthage, which ultimately led to his martyrdom. So these are facts, and they're quite different from the standard story we hear growing up. None of them prove that Joseph Smith wasn't inspired by God, but they certainly are quite shocking. And you can bet that your Mormon friend or family member who's left the church has come across most of these issues. So how about Scripture in the Book of Mormon? We learned that the Book of Mormon is the most correct book on earth. It was found in Hill Cumorah in New York, where it was buried by Moroni. We learned that it is a history of Native Americans of Central, South, and North America, and even the Pacific Islands. And we know that the Book of Abraham was translated from a papyrus that Joseph Smith got, I believe, in Kirtland. That's what we know about the Scriptures, Mormon Scriptures. Well, the facts are quite interesting. We find out in reality that there have been over 4,000 changes made to the Book of Mormon since it was created. A lot of them are minor, but some of them are quite significant. People have tried to pay attention to the geography in the Book of Mormon with the narrow neck of land and the waters of Mormon and, all the other issues surrounding how long it took people to march places and settle places. No one's ever been able to find any geography that really credibly maps to what's in the Book of Mormon. Cumorah, we know that Joseph Smith got the plates from the Hill Cumorah in New York, but it doesn't really seem to jive with the geography. Where's the narrow neck of land? Where are the waters of Mormon? It certainly probably wasn't around New York, and most of the civilization that we know about that built temples and all sorts of things the Book of Mormon describes is in Central America. But there's no way that Moroni lugged plates that were 150 pounds all the way up to New York by himself walking to bury them there. So, of course, apostles and others have tried to say that there were maybe two Cumorahs, et cetera, et cetera. But the truth is, this starts to sound a little bit sketchy. And then you think about all the anachronisms in the Book of Mormon. Anachronisms meaning something being out of place chronologically. So an example would be in a movie about the 18th century, if they had airplanes in a movie, in the 1700s, that would be out of place. Well, there are lots of things in the Book of Mormon that, when taken on face value, are chronologically out of place. Steel, was never invented by the Native Americans, yet the Book of Mormon mentions steel swords and armor, etc. All the bones for the millions of soldiers who were died and killed, where are they? Why haven't we found piles and piles and piles of bones? We certainly, have in Europe and Asia. Why not, in America? We know that horses were not found anywhere in the United States, in the world, in Central, South, or North America before the Spaniards came here. It was the Spaniards who brought horses. They did not find, the Aztecs or the Mayas or the Incas on horses. There just weren't any. Elephants, haven't existed on the American continent since, 10,000 BC, as I understand it. There certainly wasn't any steel, and if there was steel, why haven't we found the swords and the helmets and the breastplates for the millions of soldiers who killed each other? yet not one steel sword or breastplate, etc., has been found. Why is that? Barley and wheat, for example, were domesticated in Europe and have sophisticated methods to grow them. None of that stuff was here, yet the Book of Mormon mentions it being used. A 7-day calendar, etc. All these things are sort of out of place, and so it makes you wonder in the Book of Mormon why those things are there. Many of you have probably heard of the DNA controversies. Those who have sort of done DNA tests on Native Americans, over 95% of the DNA of the people tested, Native Americans tested, show that their lineage goes straight to Asia, meaning they crossed the Bering Strait, not came over on a boat from Israel and were Israelites. And so now we've backed off. For 150 years, the general authorities have called the Native Americans Lamanites, and now we don't do that anymore because we really don't know if they're Lamanites, and we're starting to say that the Book of Mormon happened maybe in a very small part of America, and we don't know quite where, but then how did millions and millions of people show up? So, these are very important questions that are fair questions. They're not just nitpicky trying to find fault in the church, but they're legitimate questions that call into question for many the historicity or the authenticity of the Book of Mormon. And finally, there was a book that was written when Oliver Cowdery was still living back in his hometown by a preacher. And this book was called A View of the Hebrews. And while no one claims that the Book of Mormon was taken word for word or even in large chunks from the View of the Hebrews, it's very interesting to note that this book, View of the Hebrews, claimed basically that a group of people left Israel and sailed to America in a boat and started civilizations in America, and that there were good and bad tribes within America that fought each other, and that these Israelis became the inhabitants and the ancestors of the current modern-day American Indians. Why was this book written 5 or 10 years before the Book of Mormon? Things like this cause, people who are credible, just trying to understand truth, to ask these questions. And of course, finally, the Book of Abraham, experts now agree, including Hugh Nibley, that the Book of Abraham is not a translation from the papyrus that Joseph Smith had. Instead, those papyrus were funeral texts that were used, whenever someone died in Egypt. But they had, everyone, including LDS scholars who have read them, agree that there's no significant correlation between the papyrus and what Joseph produced as the Book of Abraham. This is shocking stuff to find out for the first time, especially when you've been a member of the church your whole life. How about church leadership? We're told to follow the prophet, that the prophet talks with God, that the words of modern prophets are scripture, and that when the brethren have spoken, the discussion ends. We're told that Bruce R. McConkie's book, Mormon Doctrine, was just that, Mormon Doctrine. We're told that LDS general authorities are among the most righteous people in the world, or at least that's how we're raised culturally to feel. And the history and facts tell us that this isn't always the case. In spite of having some great leaders who have been great inspired men and women, they have not been perfect. We all know that Brigham Young taught, for example, that Adam was God and that God was Adam. And this was called the Adam-God theory, and he taught it all through the journal discourses. And it's something that we no longer teach or really believe as a church. He taught that blood atonement, that the best thing you can do for someone who's committed certain types of sins is kill them on the spot, and that's a favor that you can do for somebody if they've committed certain sins. One of those sins being a white person marrying a black person. He felt that was punishable by death. We all know that, if we've read the journal discourses and if you saw the previous slide, that Brigham Young was racist. And he said some horrible things about black people, including the fact that they would never, ever receive the priesthood in this life until the millennium. As far as the journal discourses go, we as a church have completely distanced ourselves from them. You won't see many quotes from the journal discourses in modern church curricula. In fact, as I understand it, at Salt Lake, the editors and the writers of church manuals have been told, use the journal discourses only as a last result. And so, we're distancing ourselves from that. Those who have studied how we've handled church history can say, without being unfair, that we've been less than candid. It's not that we've hidden everything. It's not that we've lied, but we certainly haven't been open and upfront about our history as a church. There have been many changes. This notion that the church is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and forever is not true. Major teachings have been changed, including polygamy. It was once taught that polygamy was a requirement for the celestial kingdom and an eternal law, and now we're being told that it's not doctrinal. I know that there are explanations for that, but the truth is polygamy is doctrinal. It's being practiced today in Mormon temples. When someone's spouse dies and they remarry, plural marriages happen in the Mormon temple today with those who are marrying someone, whose former spouse passed away. So also, blacks. It was once taught that blacks would never receive the priesthood. And now we don't even talk about how they were unworthy in the preexistence, etc. And we've even read in recent publications that David O. McKay believed that the ban on the blacks was actually a church policy, but not church doctrine. These are mind-blowing major shifts in perspective that a Mormon confronts. We've read recently about how the Book Mormon doctrine was received with anger by the first presidency, by David O. McKay, that he was furious that Bruce R. McConkie called it Mormon doctrine, that he commissioned a study that found over 1,000 errors in the book, that Elder McConkie was punished and censured for doing it, and that a rule was created as a result from then on saying that no general authority could publish a book without church permission. And he was told not to ever publish the book again, and in fact, the brethren seriously considered publicly censuring him and decided not to because they didn't want to undermine the authority or the mantle of the general authority. That's shocking to find out because many of us used that book for years and years and years as being doctrine, as being the gospel. Of course, most of you are familiar with Paul H. Dunn, who was a general authority who, while being a good man, claimed that he was a professional baseball player when he wasn't, and claimed that he fought in World War II in ways that he didn't, and basically made a lot of money and got a lot of fame out of telling stories that were faith-promoting but not true. George P. Lee was excommunicated. He was a general authority, a Native American general authority. Richard Lyman was an apostle in the 40s who was excommunicated for adultery. So, church leaders are not perfect. They make mistakes, sometimes really big ones. The Mark Hoffman case we've already talked about, and how the brethren were deceived and fooled. And then, we could enumerate, a decent list of abuses that have happened within the church, from not dealing with sexual, harassment or sexual abuse appropriately, either stake presidents or bishops or whoever actually performing the abuse or covering it up, etc. All sorts of baptismal abuses that have happened, including the baseball baptisms of the early 60s in Great Britain, to the soccer baptisms that I experienced on my mission in Guatemala, and ecclesiastical abuses as well. I don't mean to be saying all this to say the church is bad and ugly and nasty. It's just that you don't really get exposed to this until you start studying in depth, and then once you do, the chasm between what you thought and what actually is just really wide. Finally, what about church doctrine? Is it the same yesterday, today, and forever? Is it straight from God to the prophets? What about the word of wisdom? What about the temple ceremony? Well, as I mentioned before, it's quite shocking to hear that, on the issue of men becoming gods and vice versa, that President Hinckley would say, I don't know that we teach it, I don't know that we emphasize it. On polygamy, say it was not doctrinal. To find out that the word of wisdom wasn't a commandment until the early 1900s, that many past prophets and apostles drank alcohol and used tobacco, including Brigham Young's son, who was an apostle, that Joseph Smith had a bar in his mansion, drank wine the night before he was murdered. These are things that we're not told, and it's shocking to find them out. And then finally, those of us who went through the temple before 1990 know that there were many there were many disturbing elements of the temple ceremony that were shocking and caused many people to never want to return to the temple after the first time they went. A lot of these things have been removed, and so it begs the question, why is an ordinance that's supposed to be given directly from God changing so dramatically? And why were such disturbing things included at all? So, again, I want to just emphasize this very, very strongly. Yes, I've listed a lot of things that are shocking or disturbing about the church, to some. But I want to tell you that I have a personal conviction that nothing that I've mentioned today proves that the church is evil or satanic or false. And many of the stuff does not bother me at all and has very reasonable explanations. So my point isn't to cast stones or dispersions on the church. I'm just trying to get you to think about what your loved one is going through right now. And I want you to think about what the gap is between what they were taught, what their understanding was growing up in the church, and then what they've recently discovered. The gap is huge, and it's very troubling and disturbing. So how do they feel when they discover all this? They feel stunned. They feel betrayed. They feel lied to. They feel like a cover-up has been done. They feel disgusted, and they feel very angry. They start thinking about all the tithing they paid. They start thinking about all the times they went to the temple, all the proxy work they did. They start thinking about all the sacrifices and all the callings, and how much they gave to the church to discover that things were just so dramatically different. And it's a hard thing to go through, something that is very difficult and hopefully is worth a lot of empathy and understanding. Once this happens to you, you never look at Joseph Smith the same way again. You never look at Scripture the same way again. You don't look at the church as you used to in terms of its being, infallible. You never think of priesthood authority in the same way. You can still respect them, but whether you follow them blindly, it's a totally different matter. And for many people, their entire religious world falls apart. And not only the church comes into question, but Christ comes into question, and God himself comes into question. People are fundamentally changed relative to the gospel when they experience these historical and doctrinal issues. And when you're dealing with them, you have to understand that. You can't just pull the card to follow the brethren, or read your Book of Mormon, or do what the brethren say, or listen to the Holy Ghost, because their entire worldview has just fallen apart into shambles in many instances. And so you have to keep that in mind as you're dealing with them, because that's sort of the way it works. Now, how do we as a church tend to deal with these people who have these problems and decide to leave or fall inactive? We fear them. It's like they have leprosy, and we want to stay away from them. We give them labels that are very unproductive: anti-Mormon, ex-Mormon, apostate, dangerous, arc-steadiers. The labels go on and on and on. We literally cease communication with them. We ostracize and distance ourselves from them. And you got to think about this for a second. These people have had their entire religious world fall apart. And in a religion that's supposed to be the one true church, the one that's supposed to follow Christ's teachings, not only do they have to deal with the emotional turmoil of having their world fall apart, but they see all these people who are supposed to be Christians treat them in the least possible Christ-like manner. You have to understand that this doesn't just make them sad about the church. It makes them hate the church. It makes them want to go after the church. It turns them into some of the most rabid, mean-spirited, anti-Mormon people you could ever find, because all of a sudden, all the goodness that you would assume or ascribe to God's people all of a sudden vanishes, and people are treated inhumanely. What are the results? Marriages become challenged and threatened, and often divorce happens because the church is put above the family. Families can dissolve. Children no longer have a mother or a father. These people lose, in many instances, especially within Utah, their entire relationships within their community. And some people even suffer job loss as a result, which is a travesty as well. We have to ask ourselves as Christians, as members of the Church of Jesus Christ, what did Jesus do when he came up with instances like this? Well, Jesus actually caught a lot of flack for associating with people that weren't mainstream, Jews. He was railed upon for having dinner with the publicans, for example. When the adulteress was being attacked by all the, quote, churchgoers and the religious, he defended her and attacked them. Very interesting. He encouraged us to go after the one and to leave the 99, to go rescue that one person. He taught us to go the extra mile and even carry their backpacks as we go. Taught us to turn the other cheek. And most importantly, he just listened and he loved people. This is the only credible way to handle these situations. Yet it's the most, for some reason, counterintuitive to the average Mormon, and it's the opposite of what they most often do. So, one point I have to stress is we are not treating those who have left the church in a Christ-like manner, or those who are struggling with the church. We are treating them in many instances completely un-Christ-like. And it's doing damage to us, and it's doing incredible damage to them and to the church. Now, this naturally leads to the question of how to help. And so first I have to offer some things that we should not do. We should not fear these people. We should not judge them. We should not distance ourselves from them or ostracize them. That is the absolute worst thing we can possibly do. And we should certainly not make them a project. There's this philosophical notion of I-it versus I-thou. I-it is a relationship where I treat you like a thing, like an object. So instead of a person, you're an it. You're an object. And I have a goal for you. I want to change you in some way. I want to make you into a way that helps me or benefits me or makes me feel better. It's doing your home teaching because it's the end of the month. It's reading the scriptures just because you were told to and just sort of running through them. And most importantly, it's saying to someone who's struggling with the church, I'm going to have you as a project and get it so that you're back in the church again. That's an I-it objectified relationship. And in my opinion, more instances than not, it's doomed to failure. The other type of relationship that's worth mentioning is the I-thou relationship. And what that says is, I'm a person, you're a person. I respect you deeply. I want what's best for you. We are equals. I'm your friend. I love you. Let's go on this journey together and see how we can help each other. And that is the only paradigm that we can take with our brethren who have fallen away or been excommunicated or have left that will ever be effective. We need to decide up front we're going to be their friends no matter what, at any cost, because we love them genuinely, empathize with what they've been through, used to be their friends, and decide that we want to continue being their friends. One of the worst things we can ever do is pressure or guilt trip people into coming back, because that will backfire. And finally, trying to justify a lot of these historical or doctrinal things and practice what I'll call bad apologetics is disastrous. For example, to talk about Fawn Brody's book and say that she was a lesbian, or to talk about Michael Quinn and say, oh, he wrote these bad books, but he's gay, and so that's why he did it. Or to try and explain away, well, when they said steel in the Book of Mormon, they really meant an amalgam of these different types of metals that's easily biodegradable. There are all sorts of ways that we can perform bad apologetics, trying to apologize and in many instances explain away these credible issues that make it look like we're hiding something, make it look like we're irrational, make it look like we'll do anything to justify and to explain away something that's credible. I believe that bad apologetics can injure more testimonies than anti-Mormon literature. And in fact, I've heard people say that, bad apologetics do more to harm testimonies than anything else within Mormon literature. So these are some things not to do with your loved one who is leaving or has left the church. Now, what are some things you can do? The first thing you can do is validate and acknowledge what they've been through. You can say, man, I totally understand. I struggle with those things too. You totally have merit in the things you feel. Your feelings are valid. I validate them. You can empathize with them. You can show them unconditional love. You can say to them, I don't care if you ever come back to the church. I want you to know that I will always love you and always be your friend. And I embrace you because I respect you and I admire you and I know you're trying to do what's right. You can create genuine friendships with these people, not that are tied to their church status, but instead are tied to them being human and you being human, like I mentioned before. You can provide open forums where you listen and you learn and you don't shut up the conversation. You say, what are the things that bug you? And you don't try and explain them all away. You just listen and say, wow, I understand. You will not believe how impactful it can be to somebody just to have someone else listen to them. One thing that we all ought to think about is how we can instigate a broader education of the membership on these historical and cultural issues. Because it's very hard to go to church and hear about Brigham Young's wife when he had 50 or however many he had, or Joseph Smith's wife, or that Joseph Smith turned down alcohol when you knew that he did drink alcohol all throughout his life. And on and on and on. The Book of Mormon is the most correct book in the world when you know that there are a lot of errors. So, it's very important that members get up to speed on these issues. To say that Joseph was completely innocent when he was put to Carthage jail is not true. He lied about practicing polygamy. He ordered the destruction of a printing press, which is the destruction of private property. Some try to explain that away. But the truth is, you cannot say that he was completely innocent. You can't. And so, it's very hard for someone who's struggling to go to church and hear those things. In terms of leaders, I've heard of leaders knowing about people who are struggling with their testimony, so they find them callings where those callings will be beneficial to the person and to the church. So, for example, let someone be elders quorum teacher, but say to them, hey, the things that you're not comfortable teaching, we totally support you not teaching them and emphasizing the things that you feel good about, etc. Or a Boy Scout calling or whatever calling, is edifying to both. One of the most important things that we could ever do is provide positive role models. There are hundreds and even thousands of people on this planet who know all these issues about Mormonism, but still retain testimonies or decide to stay in it. And it's very important to match these people up with those people. Now, one thing that's unfortunate is that at some point the church started feeling uncomfortable with groups like Sunstone and Dialogue and started warning people to stay away from symposia and started excommunicating members of these groups and started telling their employees not to support Sunstone or Dialogue anymore. And what this did is it caused many of those people who had done the work to reconcile all these issues with their faith. It drove them out of the church or drove them into the underground, and it made them so scared that they don't talk anymore openly about things. And so that's unfortunate that happened. I can't say that's all the church's fault. I think that some of those organizations shared in the blame for sort of getting a little bit too far off on the edge. But providing positive role models can be an essential element to staving off these people's inactivity. And ultimately, we have to just simply respect the free agency of these people and not do it as a threat, like, okay, you can do what you want, but you better realize the consequences of what you're deciding. That's one of the most disastrous attitudes we can take with these people. We ultimately have to just say, we love you, we accept you unconditionally, we want your happiness. If your happiness is leaving the church, then I support you, but if you ever want to stay or come back, I know that I'm here to help you, but either way, I love you, I'm your friend. These are some of the things that I offer as ways to help these people and yourself, frankly. And I'd like to end with just a few messages for those who have decided to completely leave the church. And the one point I'll start out with is the following. Is perfection, or even the lack of major flaws, the measure that we should hold up as our affiliation, as our guidelines for affiliation with an organization or with our relationships with other people? And what I mean by that is, let's say you leave the Mormon church tomorrow. Are you going to find a better church, really? A church that doesn't have issues that are just as significant or even more significant? And it's not just with church, Can you name a government here in the world that doesn't have major flaws or weaknesses? And does that mean we should all renounce our citizenships globally? Can you name a business that doesn't have ethical problems or violations, yet are we still willing to work for those businesses? And you could even take it to marriages or families. Perfection is just pretty darn hard to find in this world. And even lack of serious flaws is quite hard to find. And so, if we're to hold up this expectation that we're only going to affiliate ourselves or remain members to something that lacks major flaws, will we become an island? Will we become devoid of any relationships or affiliations? Something to think about. Also, philosophically, this is something Levi Peterson told me once. Do we ever have an obligation when we're in an organization that is struggling or has problems? Do we ever have an obligation, ethically, instead of just abandoning it, to stick around and make it better? I tend to think that we do. And most importantly, there are many people in this church that are struggling with the same issues that we're having. Suffering in silence, not able to leave, but not feeling good about staying either. And these people, frankly, need help, need friends, need role models as well. And to just pack up and leave is in many ways to leave these people in a very miserable, sad state. I want you to know that there are many people who know all of these issues, don't explain them away using bad apologetics, but instead remain faithful. And so that doesn't mean that you should sort of follow the Joneses, but you should know that there are many people who know more than you do, but have decided that it's good and right to stay. And it's just something to keep in mind. Another thing that I'll add is our church, in modern times puts a unhealthy emphasis on things being true. True means, absolutely of God and the one true and the only true. And I would consider that there's nothing wrong with not thinking about true, meaning it's better than everyone else or the only one sanctioned by God, if you're uncomfortable with that terminology. There's nothing wrong with just saying, is the church good? Is it a net positive? Is it a net positive in your life? And instead of asking what's true and ordained of God, because what's the one true government? What's the one true business? The one true marriage? The one true religion? You may have a hard time if you're expecting some type of God directly involved, semi-flawless organization. What if you just set your standard for what's good? What's going to be a positive influence in your life? What's going to be good for you and your family? What's going to bring you and your loved ones the most joy? That's a standard that I think is worth considering. Another instance that is important to me, I don't look to the church as a place to be fulfilled all the time and to get all my needs met. Oftentimes I do have many important needs met, and I am served by my fellow church members. But I look at the church as an incredible place to serve other people. Where else am I going to get to know my neighbors and my community in a way that otherwise I would somewhat tend to be isolated and just keep to myself within my own home? The church is an incredible place to find out who's having a baby and needs a meal, who's sick and needs to be comforted, what service projects are available, how to help other people in a disaster, how to just get to know struggling youth, etc. And who knows, someday you may even be helped in a time of desperate need by the same community that you've developed. And I acknowledge that there are plenty of ways to serve outside of the church, but I found the church to be a dang good place to serve. And finally, probably the last point that I want to just leave with you is that there's nothing wrong with deciding that you can be a Mormon on your own terms. And what I mean by that is some of the commandments and some of the beliefs and some of the doctrines you follow wholeheartedly. And other things you just say, that's not for me. I'm not going to follow that. Or I'm going to follow that in a moderated way. Or take my own spin on that doctrine or teaching or commandment or expectation. Because in reality, every single Mormon at their core ends up being a Mormon on their own terms. Whether it's by commission or omission, none of us follows all the teachings of the church and all the commandments of the church perfectly. So since none of us reaches perfection, maybe there's nothing wrong with us just admitting that none of us are perfect and that we're going to go ahead and follow the things that we can or feel good about and leave some other things behind that we don't. So that's sort of my presentation today. I hope you've found it helpful. For those of you who have loved ones who are leaving or have left the church, I encourage you just to love them and to try and follow some of these ideas and tactics when you're dealing with them. And for those of you who are struggling with the church and wondering whether you want to leave or if you've left, I want to, sort of follow my own advice and just tell you, seek for happiness, seek for joy, but make sure that you don't follow after paths of greater sadness and unhappiness. Find ways to serve others, because that sort of becomes, that's sort of what this life is all about, is finding ways to help and serve other people and to find love and joy within your personal relationships, your family relationships, and your community relationships. So I thank you for taking your time to listen. Please feel free to email me at mormonstories@gmail.com or come up to my blog site or whatever at mormonstories.org. And please let me know